Is $599 enough to get the ultimate Ultrawide experience, or do you need to step up to the $799 price point in order to enjoy that extra screen real estate? Well, I'll be testing the Zotac Gaming RTX 4070 Ti against the Colorful RTX 4070 in 16 games across 4 Ultrawide and Super Ultrawide resolutions to help you determine which level of GPU is right for you. I'll be front-loading this review with 2023 titles and then going over the older games in the back half. I have 640 slides to get through, so without any further ado, let's get into those benchmarks. Starting us off is Cyberpunk 2077 2.0 Phantom Liberty. At 3440 by 1440, we see the RTX 4070 getting acceptable Raster performance, barely missing out on 60 FPS, while the RTX 4070 Ti is solidly in smooth range, making it 20% faster. When we look at the 1% lows, we see that both the 4070 and the 4070 Ti land in acceptable range. The raw ray tracing results see the RTX 4070 getting unplayable performance, while the 4070 Ti still only manages unacceptable performance. Turning on DLSS quality gets both cards back into acceptable range for the average, with the 4070 Ti now only 12% faster. Looking at the 1% lows, we see raw performance in the unplayable range and DLSS performance in the unacceptable range. If you want to know what path tracing looks like, you can see here that both of these cards are doing terribly, even with DLSS quality on, and only the 4090 can put up good numbers when this tech is turned on. Moving up to 3840 by 1600p resolution, we see the RTX 4070 Ti start to look like the 4070 did at the 3440 by 1440p resolution. The Raster performance at this resolution has now put both cards into acceptable range, though the 4070 Ti maintains a 20% performance advantage. The 1% lows show the 4070 dip into unacceptable range, while the 4070 Ti stays acceptable. Looking now at our raw ray tracing results, we see both cards with unplayable performance, so we look to DLSS quality to save the day, and see the 4070 still struggling in unacceptable range, with the RTX 4070 Ti and its 15% performance advantage squeaking it over the line into acceptable performance, with the 1% lows for raw ray tracing being obviously unplayable, and we see both DLSS results in unacceptable range. Now let's see how these cards handle our Super Ultrawide 5120 by 1440p resolution. At this resolution, the RTX 4070 needs upscaling for even the Raster performance, because without it, it's getting unacceptable performance, while the 4070 Ti stays 21% ahead to maintain an acceptable performance. The 1% lows have both cards in unacceptable range. Turning on the ray tracing results, we see the raw RT is even further down in unplayable range, while both DLSS quality results are now in unacceptable range. Despite the 4070 Ti's 17% advantage, 1% lows show both cards in unplayable for the RT results, and for the DLSS results we see the 4070 stay unplayable while the 4070 Ti manages to get unacceptable range. Moving to the final resolution of 5120 by 2160, where we see both cards decimated, with the 4070 getting unplayable frame rates even for Raster, and despite being 30% faster, the 4070 Ti is barely above 30 FPS itself. Both cards see unplayable 1% lows. Raw ray tracing performance on both cards is flat out broken, as their VRAM is overwhelmed, but DLSS quality setting pulls that back from the broken to unplayable for the 4070, and at 20% faster, the 4070 Ti manages to be unacceptable. 1% lows for both ray tracing and DLSS are all unplayable. Next up we have Starfield, a punishing launch style that really pushes the Raster performance of these cards. At 3440 by 1440p, we see the RTX 4070 getting 45 FPS, barely keeping it in an acceptable range, while the RTX 4070 Ti's whopping 41% faster performance puts it in smooth range. Both cards are hit hard with the 1% lows, and end up in unacceptable range. At 3440 by 1600, we now see both cards slip down a performance bucket, with the 4070 now in unacceptable range, and the 39% faster RTX 4070 Ti now in acceptable range. 1% lows don't fall quite as far for the 4070, and it manages to stay in unacceptable with the 4070 Ti. Our Super Ultrawide 5120 by 1440p resolution sees the 4070 still in unacceptable range, and the 37% faster 4070 Ti still in acceptable range, with the 1% lows of the 4070 now in unplayable, and the 4070 Ti still in unacceptable. And finally, the 5120 by 2160p resolution, where we now see the 4070's average in unplayable range, and now the 37% faster 4070 Ti is in unacceptable range, with both of their 1% lows down in unplayable territory. A beta patch may be available for some that will improve this performance, but is currently not available to the Game Pass version of the game which I am using. Next up of our 2023 games is Star Wars Jedi Survivor, where at 3440 by 1440 we see the Raster performance of the RTX 4070 get acceptable average frame rates, and the 4070 Ti gets smooth frame rates, some 32% faster than the 4070. The 1% lows see the 4070 down in unacceptable range, while the 4070 Ti is still getting an acceptable performance. Turning on ray tracing only marginally impacts the frame rate, with both cards able to hold on to their respective performance buckets, for both the average and the 1% lows. When using DLSS quality settings, we see the average performance leap way beyond what Raster was offering, and we now see the 4070 and 4070 Ti with smooth refresh rates, despite the Ti's 23% performance advantage. Their 1% lows both improved to get the 4070 to acceptable and the 4070 Ti to smooth territory. Moving up in resolution to 3840 by 1600, we see the Raster performance of the 4070 dip to unacceptable range, and the 4070 Ti, which is 31% faster, in acceptable range. The 1% lows put both cards into unacceptable territory. Turning on ray tracing doesn't knock either card out of its respective bucket, with the 4070 still unacceptable and the 4070 Ti still acceptable. When turning on DLSS quality, both cards end up with smooth refresh rates, though the 4070 Ti is still 26% faster. Looking at the RT 1% lows, we see the raw results have the 4070 unplayable and the 4070 Ti in unacceptable. But DLSS results have the 4070 in unacceptable and the 4070 Ti in acceptable range. Moving up to the Super Ultrawide 5120 by 1440p resolution, we see the RTX 4070 still hang on to unacceptable performance, while the 31% faster 4070 Ti is hanging on to acceptable performance. The 1% lows see the 4070 hit unplayable, and the 4070 Ti hit unacceptable performances. Turning on ray tracing sees both cards in unacceptable range, and when DLSS is turned on, the 4070 comes up just short and ends up with an acceptable performance, while the 27% faster 4070 Ti still manages smooth gameplay. Looking at the ray tracing 1% lows, we have unplayable and unacceptable for the two raw results, and for the DLSS results, we see the 4070 with unacceptable frame rates and the 4070 Ti with acceptable frame rates. And final resolution of 5120 by 2160, we see it get real rough, with the 4070 in unplayable range and the 4070 Ti at 34% faster, but it's still in unacceptable. Both have unplayable 1% lows. The raw RT results mirror the Raster results, while the DLSS results are in a better place, with the 4070 at the top end of unacceptable range and 30% faster 4070 Ti squarely unacceptable. The RT 1% lows see both cards unplayable, and the 4070 stays unplayable even with DLSS, but the 4070 Ti managed to get to unacceptable performance. Next up we have Diablo 4, which should be a little kinder to these two GPUs. Starting off with 3440 by 1440p resolution, we see our first high refresh rate result, with the 4070 delivering 106 FPS, and the 4070 Ti delivers our first very high refresh rate result of 144 FPS, 36% faster than the 4070. 1% lows are a bit closer between the two, both in high refresh rates. Moving up to 3840 by 1600, the 4070 manages to hang on to those high refresh rates, and the 4070 Ti comes down to join it, now only 19% faster. 1% lows see both cards in smooth range. The 5120 by 1440p Super Ultrawide resolution is not supported by Diablo 4 and will crop down to 3440 by 1440, but it will not return all of your frame rate, not by a long shot. Both cards seem almost artificially limited to their high refresh rates, with only 2% difference between them, and nearly matching smooth 1% lows as well. The massive resolution of 5120 by 2160 manages to just slip the 4070's average below 60 FPS, dropping it into acceptable performance, where the 27% faster 4070 Ti still manages to put up a solid smooth refresh rate, and the 1% lows show some tight variances, allowing both to stay in their respective performance buckets. Next up we have Forza Motorsport. At 3440 by 1440, we see that both the 4070 and 4070 Ti are getting smooth refresh rates, with the Ti getting 20% more frames. When we look at the 1% lows, we see both in acceptable range, with the 4070 actually having higher frame rate.
This is because the 4070 Ti is dipping momentarily into CPU-bound scenarios, which in Forza's current state means 1% lows go out the window. Only once it's fully GPU-bound will it get tight 1% lows again. Looking at our Ultra Ray Tracing results, we see that the performance reduction is on a more reasonable side, with both cards ending up with acceptable performance. Since, like Forza Horizon, Forza Motorsport doesn't scale well with resolution, DLSS is not an effective way to gain back frame rate, so instead I have used car-only RT setting, since they are most important things to ray trace. With these settings, we see both cards return to smooth gameplay, with the 4070 Ti seeing a 16% advantage. Looking at the 1% lows, we see the full RT with unacceptable refresh rates for the 4070 and acceptable for the 4070 Ti. The car only brings the 4070 up to acceptable and the 4070 Ti back to smooth. Both ray tracing settings are heavy enough to keep the 4070 Ti from experiencing wild CPU-bound frame drops, providing 4070 Ti users a better frame rate experience when ray tracing cards than it does when just using raster settings. Moving up to the 3840 by 1600p resolution, we see the raster performance stay in smooth range for both cards, with the RTX 4070 Ti providing 16% more frames. 1% lows are both in acceptable range, with the Ti still suffering from CPU-bound scenarios. Full RT sees both cards in acceptable range, and only ray tracing with the car seems to bring them both back into smooth range, with the 4070 Ti providing 16% more frames. 1% lows see both cards in unacceptable range for full ray tracing, and acceptable range for RT cars, with ray tracing once again curing the 4070 Ti's 1% low issues. Moving up to the Super Ultrawide 5120 by 1440p resolution, we see both cards still in smooth range, with the 4070 Ti managing a 16% lead. The 1% lows show the 4070 in acceptable range, while the 4070 Ti is in an unacceptable range, thanks to still not being 100% GPU bound. Full ray tracing sees the 4070 fall into unacceptable range, and the 4070 Ti stay in acceptable. Ray tracing only the car sees the 4070 get to the top end of acceptable performance, and the 4070 Ti is 17% faster, making it back into smooth range. The 1% lows for full RT of both cards in unacceptable range, and the car RT has them both in acceptable range. At the final resolution of 5120 by 2160, we see the 4070 knocked out of smooth range, down to acceptable levels, while the 17% faster 4070 Ti keeps its hold on smooth gameplay. The 1% lows see the 4070 barely fall into unacceptable range, and the 4070 Ti is finally fully GPU bound and getting acceptable 1% lows. Turning on the full ray tracing, we see both cards in unacceptable range, and turning on car-only ray tracing, we see both cards in acceptable range, with the 4070 Ti still getting 17% more frames than the 4070. 1% lows see both cards fully ray tracing in unacceptable, while the 4070 stays there for the car RT, and the 4070 Ti manages acceptable performance. Our next 2023 game is Lies of P, where our 3440 by 1440p resolution sees the 4070 getting high refresh rates, while the 4070 Ti sees very high refresh rates, 27% faster than the 4070. When we look at the 1% lows, we see the 4070 with smooth refresh rates, and the 4070 Ti with high refresh rates. Moving up to 3840 by 1600p resolution, we see the 4070 hang on to high refresh rates, and the 4070 Ti is still 30% faster and retains very high refresh rates. 1% lows, however, see both cards drop down a performance tier, with the 4070 now in acceptable range and the 4070 Ti in smooth range. Moving up to the Super Ultrawide 5120 by 1440 resolution, we see the RTX 4070 now in smooth refresh range, with the 4070 Ti 31% faster and high refresh range. Looking at the 1% lows, we see the 4070 stay in acceptable range, and the 4070 Ti stay in smooth range. At the final resolution of 5120 by 2160, we see the 4070 crash down to acceptable range, while the 32% faster 4070 Ti now sees smooth performance. The 1% lows for both cards are not pretty, with them falling into unacceptable range. Next up we have Forspoken. At 3440 by 1440, both cards are getting acceptable frame rates, with the 4070 Ti seeing a small 6% lead. The 1% lows do have the 4070 best the 4070 Ti by hanging on to acceptable range, while the Ti slips into unacceptable. Turning on ray tracing sees a minimal dip in performance, and both cards are still in acceptable range, with DLSS quality getting them both into smooth range, with the 4070 Ti still managing a slim lead of 8%. 1% lows show them both in unacceptable range for the RT results, and acceptable range for the DLSS results. At 3440 by 1600p, both cards are getting acceptable frame rates, with 4070 Ti seeing a small 5% lead. The 1% lows do have both cards in unacceptable range. Turning on ray tracing sees a minimal dip in performance, but it's enough to drop the 4070 to unacceptable, while the 4070 Ti is still in acceptable range. And the DLSS quality gets the 4070 up to the top of the acceptable range, while the 7% faster 4070 Ti still maintains a smooth performance. 1% lows show them both in an unacceptable range for the RT result, but the 4070 in acceptable range for DLSS results, and the 4070 Ti is staying in unacceptable range. At the Super Ultrawide 5120 by 1440p resolution, the 4070 is only in unacceptable range, while the 8% faster 4070 Ti is barely hanging on to acceptable performance. 1% lows have both cards in unacceptable range. Turning on ray tracing sees a minimal hit to performance, but does put both cards into unacceptable range. Turning on DLSS quality gets both cards up to acceptable range, with the 4070 Ti getting a 12% lead. 1% lows for both cards for both RT and DLSS are in unacceptable range. Moving up to 5120 by 2160, we see both cards now in unacceptable range, with the 4070 Ti a scant 6% faster. 1% lows for both cards dip into unplayable range. Turning on ray tracing sees the 4070 fall into unplayable range, while the 4070 Ti hangs on to unacceptable. Turning on DLSS gets the 4070 to unacceptable performance, and the 19% faster 4070 Ti to acceptable performance. 1% lows see both cards with unplayable performance for the RT result, and unacceptable performance for the DLSS 1% lows. And for our 8th and final 2023 release, we have Payday 3. Starting with 3440 by 1440p, we see both cards hitting high refresh rates, with the 4070 Ti maintaining a 27% performance advantage. The 1% lows show the 4070 and 4070 Ti now in smooth range. Moving up to 3840 by 1600 sees the 4070 drop to smooth range, while the 27% faster 4070 Ti stays in high refresh rates. 1% lows have the 4070 in acceptable range, and the 4070 Ti in smooth range. Moving up to the Super Ultrawide 5120 by 1440p resolution sees both cards in smooth range for the average, but the 4070 Ti is still seeing a 28% performance advantage. 1% lows show the 4070 dropping to unacceptable range, and the 4070 Ti landing in acceptable range. The 5120 by 2160p resolution knocks both cards out of smooth range, with the 4070 falling all the way to unacceptable, and the 33% faster 4070 Ti down in acceptable range. The 1% lows show the 4070 with unplayable frame rates, and the 4070 Ti with unacceptable ones. We've now gotten to our legacy benchmark games. We're going to breeze through these, skipping over individual discussions of 1% lows, as all these games are pretty mature and have stable 1% lows that range from could be better to very good. And since it's Nvidia versus Nvidia, there aren't any real fluctuations that need to be called out. Plus, we'll talk about all the game 1% lows in the resolution roundup at the end of this video. Starting off, we have Shadows of the Tomb Raider. At 3440 by 1440, we see both cards with very high refresh rates and only 6% difference between them. Raw ray tracing has the 4070 getting smooth gameplay, and the 4070 Ti is in high refresh rates. Turning on DLSS sees the 4070 go to high refresh rates, and the 4070 Ti return to very high refresh rates, now 12% faster than the 4070. All 1% lows are in a reasonable range. Moving to 3840 by 1600, we see both cards drop to high refresh rates, with a modest 9% difference in performance between them. The raw RT results show both in smooth range, and the DLSS quality results put them back into high refresh rates, with the 4070 Ti now leading by 14%. All 1% lows are in a reasonable range. At the Super Ultrawide 5120 by 1440 resolution, the RTX 4070 is now in smooth range, while the 12% faster 4070 Ti stays in high refresh rates. Raw RT puts the 4070 in just acceptable range, and the 4070 Ti in smooth range. Turning on DLSS cards gets both cards back up with the 4070 in smooth, and the 4070 Ti is 16% faster with high refresh rates. All 1% lows are in a reasonable range. The 5120 by 2160 resolution has both cards in smooth range, with the 4070 Ti seeing a 10% lead. Turning on ray tracing sees the 4070 drop to unacceptable range, while the 4070 Ti manages acceptable performance. But turning on DLSS quality sees them both back into smooth range, with the 4070 Ti leading by 17%. All 1% lows are at a reasonable deviation from the average. Next is Forza Horizon at 3440 by 1440. The 4070 is getting high refresh rates, while the 4070 Ti is 21% faster, landing it in very high refresh rates. Turning on ray tracing sees the frame rate dip slightly, putting both cards into high refresh rates. Turning on DLSS sees the 4070 remain in high refresh rates, and the 18% faster 4070 Ti return to very high refresh rates. 1% lows in this title are very good. Moving to 3840 by 1600 sees both cards in high refresh range, with the 4070 Ti 20% faster, and they stay in high refresh range for both the ray tracing and the DLSS results, with the Ti now leading by 19%. 1% lows in this title are still very good. At the Super Ultrawide 5120 by 1440 resolution, we see the 4070 slip into smooth range, with the 21% faster 4070 Ti getting high refresh rates. Turning on ray tracing doesn't change anything for either card, but DLSS quality brings the 4070 back into high refresh rates with the 18% faster 4070 Ti. 1% lows in this title are still doing very well. Moving up to the 5120 by 2160 resolution, we see both cards land in smooth refresh range, with the 4070 Ti maintaining a 21% lead. Turning on ray tracing doesn't see that change, but DLSS quality sees the 4070 stay in smooth range, but the 36% faster 4070 Ti get back into high refresh range. Again, 1% lows in this title are still very good. Next up is Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. At 3440 by 1440, the 4070 joins the 4070 Ti in very high refresh rates for the second time. Turning on ray tracing sees a significant hit for both cards, with them both falling into smooth range. But turning on DLSS quality sees the 4070 back up into high refresh rates and the 4070 Ti in very high refresh rates. 1% lows for this title are on the average side. Moving up to 3840 by 1600p resolution, we see the 4070 drop into high refresh rates, while the 4070 Ti remains in very high refresh rates. Turning on ray tracing sees both cards drop significantly, with the 4070 down in acceptable range, while the 4070 Ti is getting smooth gameplay. Turning on DLSS increases both cards' performance a fair bit, giving the 4070 smooth gameplay and the 4070 Ti high refresh rates. 1% lows at this resolution are still average, but improving. Moving up to 5120 by 1440p Super Ultrawide resolution sees both cards average raster performance and high refresh rates. Turning on ray tracing knocks them both down into acceptable range, but DLSS brings them back up with the 4070 in smooth range and the 4070 Ti in high refresh range. 1% lows are now slightly better than average. Moving up to our highest resolution of 5120 by 2160, we see both cards still manage smooth gameplay, though when ray tracing is turned on, those cards are knocked way down into unacceptable range. But DLSS brings the 4070 back up into acceptable and the 4070 Ti into smooth gameplay. 1% lows remain on the better side of average at this resolution. Next up we have Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and starting at our 3440 by 1440p resolution, we see the 4070 getting smooth refresh rates and the 4070 Ti with high refresh rates. 1% lows in this game are below average. Moving up to 3840 by 1600, we see both cards now getting smooth refresh rates. The 1% lows are still below average. Moving up to 5120 by 1440 Super Ultrawide resolution, both cards maintain smooth refresh rates, with no change to the 1% low deviation. And finally, at our final resolution, of 5120 by 2160, we see both cards fall into acceptable range, and they still maintain subpar 1% lows. Next up is Borderlands 3. Played at 3440 by 1440, we see that the 4070 is getting smooth refresh rates, while the 4070 Ti is getting high refresh rates, with 1% lows that are slightly below average. At 3840 by 1600, we see both cards now in smooth range. The 1% lows are still slightly below average. Moving up to 5120 by 1440 Super Ultrawide resolution, we see the 4070 dip into acceptable range, while the 4070 Ti maintains smooth refresh rates. It's now getting a squarely average 1% low. And moving up to our final resolution of 5120 by 2160, we see the 4070 fall deep into unacceptable range, while the 4070 Ti is getting an acceptable performance. We now see mixed 1% low results. Next up we have Horizon Zero Dawn, which at 3440 by 1440p sees both cards getting high refresh rates, with average 1% lows. Moving up to 3840 by 1600p, we see the 4070 with smooth refresh rates, while the 4070 Ti maintains high refresh rates. 1% lows again are average. Moving up to 5120 by 1440p Super Ultrawide resolution, we see both cards now in smooth refresh rates, with once again average deviation for the 1% lows. And finally, at our highest resolution of 5120 by 2160, we see only acceptable performance out of both cards, with a mostly average 1% low. Next we have Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Extraction. Here we see both cards getting very high refresh rates, with slightly below average 1% lows. Moving up to 3840 by 1600, we see the 4070 dip to high refresh rates, while the 4070 Ti maintains very high refresh rates, and the 1% lows are now average. Moving up to 5120 by 1440, we see both cards maintain their respective performance levels, with the 4070 in high and the 4070 Ti in very high refresh rates, with average 1% lows. And finally, at 5120 by 2160, we see both cards dip down to smooth refresh rates, with 1% lows squarely in the average deviation range. And our final game is Total War Warhammer III, where we see at 3440 by 1440, both cards are getting smooth gameplay, with very tight 1% lows. Moving up to 3840 by 1600p, we see the 4070 drop to acceptable range, while we see the 4070 Ti maintain smooth gameplay. The 1% lows are still very good. Moving to 5120 by 1440p Super Ultrawide resolution sees both cards now in acceptable range, and the 1% lows stay extremely tight. And in our final resolution on our final game, we see both cards dip into unacceptable territory, though they maintain extremely good 1% low deviation. Now that we've looked at each game individually, let's look at how they all stack up at each ultra-wide resolution, so you can see holistic experience for each card. Let's start by checking out the 3440 by 1440p resolution, starting with Raster results, then moving on to the RT results. Here we see the RTX 4070 Ti with a very respectable 6 games getting very high refresh rates, over 120 FPS, with 4 more games with high refresh rates over 90 FPS, 5 games with smooth refresh rates over 60 FPS, and only 1 game that dips below 60 with an acceptable frame rates. When we switch over to the 4070, we see it manage 3 games with very high refresh rates, 5 games with high refresh rates, 4 games with smooth refresh rates, and 4 games with only acceptable performance. Looking at the 1% lows, we see the RTX 4070 Ti with 11 of the 16 games getting over 60 FPS 1% lows, with only 5 games having 1% lows dip below 60, where the RTX 4070 sees half its games get 1% lows above 60 and half below. When turning on ray tracing plus DLSS quality, we see the RTX 4070 Ti still manage 3 games with very high refresh rates above 120 FPS. No games get high refresh rates, 3 smooth refresh rate games, and 1 acceptable refresh rate, where the 4070 gets 3 high refresh rate games, 3 smooth refresh rate, and 1 acceptable refresh rate. As for ray tracing 1% lows, we see the RTX 4070 Ti able to keep 5 of the 7 games above 60, with only 2 falling below, while the RTX 4070 only keeps 3 of the 7 games above 60, with the other 4 falling below.
So, how do these two stack up at this resolution? Well, with half of our 2023 titles unable to hit 60 before applying any sort of upscaling, it makes the RTX 4070 look like more of a 1440p high settings card, or Ultra plus DLSS quality card, than a true ultra quality card like the 4070 Ti seems to be, which only sees 1 game dip below 60. The 4070 Ti also manages to get 2 of our 2023 titles over 120 FPS, while the 4070 Ti doesn't manage to get any of them that high. And the 4070 Ti managed 2/3 of the games over 60 FPS for the 1% lows, where only half of the games run by the 4070 manage that feat. Ray tracing with DLSS quality on sees both cards with respectable performances for the averages, with only Cyberpunk bringing them both below 60. Though when we look at the 1% lows, we see that the 4070 Ti now has an experiential advantage over the 4070.
At the 3840 by 1600p resolution, we see the 4070 Ti manage 3 games with very high refresh rates, 5 games with high refresh rates, 4 games with smooth refresh rates, and 4 games with acceptable refresh rates. Looking at the 4070, we see 6 games with high refresh rates, 5 with smooth refresh rates, 3 with acceptable refresh rates, and 2 with unacceptable refresh rates. When looking at the 1% lows, the 4070 Ti has 9 games above 60 FPS and 7 games below, while the 4070 sees only 5 games above 60 FPS, with the other 11 below. Turning on ray tracing with DLSS quality, we see the 4070 Ti get 3 games and high refresh rates, 3 games with smooth refresh rates, and 1 with acceptable refresh rates, where the 4070 gets 2 games with high refresh rates, 3 games with smooth refresh rates, 1 with acceptable, and 1 with unacceptable refresh rates. When we look at the 1% lows for ray tracing, we see the 4070 Ti get 3 games above 60 and 4 games below, and the 4070 matches it, getting 3 games above 60 and 4 games below.
The resolution increase from going from 3440 by 1440 to 3840 by 1600 sees the 4070 Ti look a lot like the 4070 did at the 1440p resolution. This increase in resolution turns the 4070 Ti from a pure ultra settings card to an ultra plus DLSS or a high settings graphics card, while the 4070 it still probably can get 60 FPS in almost all the titles when using DLSS quality. It is now just barely able to do it. And that's hardly the best starting point for a card that you're intending to keep for 3+ years. The ray tracing results bear out the Raster conclusion, with both cards doing fine once DLSS quality is turned on, except for Cyberpunk 2077, 2.0, and Phantom Liberty, where we see the 4070 struggling but still managing. But the 4070 is going to need a real reduction in visuals to get a decent frame rate.
At the 5120 by 1440p resolution, we see the RTX 4070 Ti getting 1 very high refresh rate game, with 5 high refresh rate, and 5 smooth games, and 5 acceptable games, where the RTX 4070 sees 3 high refresh rate games, 7 smooth games, 2 acceptable, and 4 unacceptable games. And when we look at the 1% lows, we see the RTX 4070 Ti with 7 games above 60 and 9 games below, while the RTX 4070 sees only 5 games above 60 and 11 games below. Turning on ray tracing with DLSS quality sees the RTX 4070 Ti with 3 games in high refresh rates, 2 in smooth, 1 in acceptable, and 1 in unacceptable range, while the RTX 4070 sees 1 high refresh rate game, 2 smooth games, 3 acceptable games, and 1 unacceptable game. Looking at the ray tracing 1% lows shows the 4070 Ti with 3 games above 60 and 4 games below, while the 4070 has 2 games above 60 and 5 games below.
This resolution sees the 4070 Ti likely able to get all Raster performance to 60 FPS using DLSS quality on all the AAA titles. But the Raster performance shows a very different story, where Forspoken will need a little extra help beyond what DLSS quality can do. And Cyberpunk 2077 is going to need a lot of extra help, where you'll need to go to DLSS performance, maybe even ultra performance, or turn off ray tracing settings to get this card to 60. And any current or future path tracing games will be off the table. At this resolution, however, the RTX 4070 is outclassed by half of our 2023 titles, and will need to go well beyond DLSS quality to get their frame rate up to 60 FPS. Not to mention, over 2/3 of the 1% lows are below 60 on all these titles. That is, to me, an unacceptable starting point for a card that you intend to keep for years. 5120 by 1440 is stressing the RTX 4070 Ti, and it's just too much for the RTX 4070. And frame generation can't save you from a sub 60 FPS experience. If you want to find out why, you can check out this video that I made here.
At our final resolution of 5120 by 2160, the RTX 4070 Ti sees 7 games in smooth refresh rates, 4 games in acceptable, and 5 games in unacceptable refresh rates, where the RTX 4070 sees 4 games in smooth, 5 games in acceptable, 4 games in unacceptable, and 3 games in unplayable range. When looking at the 1% lows, the RTX 4070 Ti sees only 5 games above 60, and the rest of the games well below, where the RTX 4070 sees only a single game maintain a 60 FPS 1% low, with everything else below 60. When we turn on ray tracing plus DLSS quality, we see the RTX 4070 Ti get 1 game in high refresh rates, 2 games in smooth refresh rates, 3 games in acceptable refresh rates, and 1 game in unacceptable, where the RTX 4070 sees 2 smooth games, 2 acceptable games, 2 unacceptable games, and 1 unplayable game. When looking at the ray tracing 1% lows, we see that RTX 4070 Ti managed 2 games above 60 and 5 games below, while the RTX 4070 manages 1 game above 60 and 6 games below.
As for the viability of these cards at the 5120 by 2160 resolution, well, neither card is up to the task. And if you're planning on getting either one of these cards for this resolution, hopefully it's for non-gaming reasons. With the 4070 Ti having a 17% performance advantage, but costing 30% more, that means the 4070 is going to win the price performance war all day. But there is a true experiential difference between these two cards at some of these resolutions. If I was gaming at 3440 by 1440, and I was trying to pick between these two cards, and that extra $200 was going to be a real hard ask for me, then I'd be completely fine getting the 4070. DLSS is going to help you out in some of the tougher titles, and you're going to have a fine experience overall. If that extra $200 wasn't an issue, and I just wanted the best deal, I would go for the 4070 Ti. I think the experience the better 1% lows are going to give you, and the safety of having a more powerful card as new games come out and ask more of you, is going to be worth it. If I was gaming at 3840 by 1600 and I was picking from these two cards, I would definitely go for the 4070 Ti. The 4070 is just not worth the savings. The performance just isn't there to make me confident that I would enjoy its experience for the next 3 or so years. Where the 4070 Ti will be fine, and DLSS will keep it going through that period, no problem. If you're a super ultrawide gamer with a 5120 by 1440p resolution, then the 4070 Ti is the only one of these two cards that makes any kind of sense. The 4070 is just too weak and will not give you a good experience going forward. The 4070 itself is struggling a little bit at this resolution, and I'd really advise you look up at least at the 7900 XTX, or if you can spend the extra money, the 4080, to get a better experience at this resolution. If I was looking to buy either of these cards for the 5120 by 2160p resolution, well, frankly, I wouldn't, unless it was for something outside of gaming. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy Ultrawide content, please like and subscribe. If you want to see the 4070 Ti versus the 7900 XT, or the 4080, please check out these videos here. And if I helped you make a purchasing decision on these cards, please use one of my affiliate links in the description below to help this channel out. It doesn't cost you anything, and it really helps me keep this channel going. I'm Scott, and I'll see you next time, Ultrawide fans.